Right, hello everyone. My name is David Kiernan and I'm a Curriculum Officer at NCFE, and you're very welcome to this webinar for the Unit 1 for the Level 1 and Level 2 Technical Award in Graphic Design. And we're very fortunate as well today to be joined by Leslie Davis, one of our external quality assurers and a subject specialist in graphic design. During this webinar, do ask any questions you have within the question box. And also you should be able to download a PDF version of the slides that we're going to go through. You should have a little section that says handouts where you can download and save the slides that we're going through today. And the plan for today's webinar is to first of all just give you a brief overview of the v-cert qualification in case there's some people who may not have taught us here before. We're going to go, Leslie Davis is going to go through a summary of the learning outcomes and grading descriptors for Unit 1. We're going to have a look at some learner work, so a Level 2 pass piece of work and a Level 2 distinction piece of work. And finally, any further questions that you may have or how to address them to us, I'll show you that at the end. But as I said, at any point during this webinar, please do ask any questions you may have. But first, I would just like to run a little poll, just asking you how confident you feel regarding the whole grading, assessing of the Unit 1 in graphic design, with 1 being not very confident at all to 10 where you're very confident in what you're doing. So I'll just leave that poll on there now. Hopefully you can all see. Just pop in where your confidence is. Okay, I think we've nearly got all the votes in there. Someone in particular, yeah, first time you've run this course, okay. Right, so it looks like majority of people, about 67%, are in the 3 to 4 range for their confidence, with 33% just a little bit higher than that at the 5 to 6 range. So hopefully we'll be able to help everyone out and make you all feel a bit more confident with Unit 1, at least. So we're going to begin just with a brief overview of this qualification and how it works. And the focus of this is going to be on the Unit 1 graphic design work, but we'll do this brief summary first. If you are new to this course completely, and you do want a more comprehensive overview, then we do have induction webinars for the Level 1 and Level 2 technical awards, which go into the whole assessment, marking, the external assessment, the exam, all of that sort of system of it in much more detail. So if you join one of the Level 1, Level 2 technical award induction webinars, that might be more beneficial, and they are run on a monthly basis. But brief overview first. So the Level 1, Level 2 technical award in graphic design has got 2 components to it. There's an external assessment, which is worth 50%, and there's the internally assessed coursework, which is also worth 50% of the final grade. And graphic design has got 4 units, and each unit is internally assessed with the coursework. Now those first 3 units are also externally assessed with the invigilated external assessment, and learners are entitled to 1 resubmission of the internally assessed coursework once the external quality assurer visit has taken place. They're also allowed 1 resit of the external assessment as well. And if your learners are doing the Level 2 qualification, then do bear in mind that they will need to achieve a minimum of a Level 2 pass in each internal assessment and in the external assessment overall to meet the necessary requirements for a Level 2 technical award in graphic design. If it looks like your learners aren't going to achieve that, then it would be best to register them onto the Level 1 course. Now, QualHub is going to be your primary go-to for resources, the specification, assessment, regulations, and so much more. And the best place to begin is your own subject page. So if you begin typing your qualification just into that search bar, if you know the qualification code, or even just Level 2 technical award, you will get a list of options there. And once you're on your page, one of the key things, especially since we're focusing on Unit 1 and the internal assessment today, We do have assignments that are ready for you to use on the Graphic Design Qual Hub page. So as you can see here, there is an assignment ready for each of the 4 units. Now you may wish to change aspects of the scenario and so on so that it's more suitably contextualized for your learners. That's absolutely fine. You can write your own assignments from scratch if needs be, but obviously be very careful with that. They have to make sure that they meet all the necessary requirements in the specification. But this is probably the easiest way to go about it. Just look at the ready-made assignments we have there for you. And the first thing that you will notice on these assignments is that the brief is going to contain a scenario, and that's designed to give a real life situation, just in order to help to set the assignment in context. After that, the assignment gives some further details on specific information that should be included. And then we have different ways that that evidence can be presented, and we do try to keep this as open as possible to appeal to many different types of learners. And then on the following page, we do have the grading descriptors, and these here is what you would be marking the units actually on and what the learners need to do for that grade. So all ready for you to use. And a final note just on the grading. Each unit, so unit 1, the introduction to graphic design, that's the one we're going to be looking at today. Each unit does consist of 3 learning outcomes, and each learning outcome is actually graded. So to get a pass in the unit, the learner would need to achieve a minimum of a pass for each learning outcome. If they get a pass in one outcome and get merits in the other 2 outcomes, then the final grade is still a pass. So the final grade for a unit is going to be the lowest grade the learner achieved in a learning outcome. There is compensatory grading system when you're combining all the units together at the end, but within a single unit, they have to demonstrate that same basic level of competency for each learning outcome in order to achieve that level grade for that unit. Now, as I said, that was a brief overview of the qualification. There's lots of other details and minutiae to go into. So if you want something more comprehensive, one of our induction webinars would be useful to join onto, or you can contact the curriculum team directly, and I'll remind you of our emails at the end. So I'm not seeing any questions that have come in at the minute. So at this point, we'll get into some more of the nitty-gritty of the qualification. And I'm going to hand over to Leslie now, who's going to give you a summary of the unit, and we'll show you some example work as well. So Leslie, I'll let you take over here.
Thanks, David. Thanks very much for that. That was really useful. A good reminder, I think, for all of us of the overview of the qualification. So hi everyone, good to be here this afternoon. I'm hoping that this webinar will support you in your centres with your delivery and your assessment. As David mentioned, please do use the question tab on the screen rather than the chat screen to input any questions as we move through this content. And usually, I don't know if anyone's attended any of these before, but usually we find it works best as for questions to come in as we go. And as I go through each learning outcome, I will ask David for an update on the questions. So for example, at the end of learning outcome 1, address those before we move on to learning outcome 2. And so on, and that usually is the best way, rather than sort of leaving all of the questions towards the end. So that's a really good way to do that. Also, just to remind you as well, because these sessions, although they're very informative, sometimes centres, assessors have questions afterwards. So when they actually start to put this into practice, we get a lot of questions that appear then. So please do remember that you'll have a link to this webinar will be sent to you tomorrow, I understand. And there is also a PDF in the handout tab of this presentation, and that will include the samples of learner work that we will look at as well. So that will be really useful for you to refer back to. So I think we'll start with learning outcome 1. So, and just to remind you that unit 1, it's an internally assessed unit. However, the content of unit 1 is actually drawn into the external assessed component of the qualification. So the external assessment covers content from units 1, 2 and 3. So just a reminder there, because it can be quite different to some of the qualifications that you might be delivering. Unit 4 of this graphic design qualification is internally assessed only, as that is a portfolio unit. So unit 1, the content will be used within the external assessment. So really important that this is delivered to students as early as possible. So here we can see that there's 3 learning outcomes for unit 1. So learners have to demonstrate their understanding of the components of graphic design. They need to also evidence their experimentation with the graphic design components, and also review the graphic design experimentation. So it's important to understand that learning outcome 3 is actually a review of their own work. So it's not of existing examples that might be used for learning outcome 1, which they do a little bit more of research and investigating existing work. And also that there are 6 components for learning outcome 1, learning outcome 2, and then outcome 3. And that gives the context of how learners will evidence their work. And here are the 6 components here. So we've got colour, tone, line, composition, typography, and imagery. And it is really up to centres how they wish to deliver this content. You may want to split this into a series of formal lessons or practical workshops, or you may want to combine delivery with guest speakers or other relevant activities. Once the unit content has been delivered, learners will then need to be set an internal assessment task to demonstrate their understanding. And at this stage, learners should work independently, as this will be an internal assessment. Again, it's up to centres how they wish to do this. Some good examples we have seen of evidence is within a PowerPoint presentation. They usually work quite well. Learners like using this application. They find it quite easy to use, or sometimes we see illustrated research reports as well, and that's fine. And again, we don't actually stipulate the form of evidence. We're actually quite flexible, so any other appropriate method would be fine. It is important to remember that each bullet component, so each of these 6 components we call assessment points, must be included for a level 2 pass, and at least 2 of the bullets for a level 1 pass. We'll look at the assessment criteria shortly. Further to this, learners must have access to a broad range of examples, and this may require some tutor guidance, and these could be in the assignment brief. And when I refer to an assignment brief, this is the internal assessment task or the internal assessment project brief, whatever you may call it. However, learners should also be finding their own examples here. So it's very much an investigation, research, learning outcome, where learners will start to look at examples of how these components are used in existing graphic design work. And David also pointed out to some useful resources on QualHub earlier, and that's where there is some examples of assignment briefs, internal assessment tasks that centres can use. And I really do encourage taking a look at those, even if you've got your own ideas and your own plans, or your centre might have a particular style of assignment that they like to use. It's definitely worth taking a look at those, even as a guide, just to make sure that you're sort of pitching the tasks at the correct level and that they're including all of the required evidence to achieve that, that range of pass, merit and distinction criteria. So here we can see the level 2 assessment criteria. Really good to mention here that sometimes there's especially when you're new to this type of assessment grid, if you like, and applying these assessment criteria, it really is good to look at the examples on the right column here. So we've got the graded descriptor on the left for a pass, merit and distinction, and then an example of what that might look like in practice. And it's good to mention here that to achieve a merit, they must do more than just describe each component. They also need to make some links between them. And that you know, that is quite a significant difference. So if students were just to sort of list those 6 components with a description, you know, you're talking about a pass here, but to achieve a merit, they must actually start to make links between them. So for example, they could have an example of a graphic design that they can describe how colour, line and tone has been used within that graphic design. And for a distinction, they need to develop this further by actually explaining this in more detail, and they must use more than one example. And here we can see the level 1 assessment criteria. This may be slightly easier to interpret as it's mostly quantified regarding how many components the learner needs to identify. So for pass, identifies 2 obvious points without explanation. So it gives a little bit more explanation of what we're looking for a pass and merit and distinction there with these 2 for a pass, identifies 3 points for a merit and distinction, 3 points. However, the difference there is for a distinction, they must have some explanation there. And even at the higher grade, you know, there is some evidence of some basic explanation there for level 1. So we're not looking for a great amount of detail there. So before we move on to learning outcome 2, David, I'll just check to see if there are any questions come in.
Yeah, 3 questions, another one's just popped in. So should students be identifying sources of imagery they are using?
Yes, always useful. I think the question there is regarding whether the source whether they've used a website or a book, etc. It's not in the criteria, but it's good practice to do that. You know, maybe they can put a web link there or just identify the source. You know, we're not looking for sort of academic referencing, but yeah, always useful to get them into the practice for doing that for any research element really. And that also prepares them for the external assessment where they might have to do some research. Really good question actually, because it's really important that we can differentiate between what's the learner's own work and an existing source.
Another question here. Can their evidence, although independent, can include classwork?
Yes, they can. What it shouldn't be is, what we wouldn't want is a submission for the internal assessment to just be, you know, a number of tasks that have been delivered as part of the teach and learning class tasks, if you like. So, because in that way, every student wouldn't really be able to respond independently to a given brief. They would all sort of be doing the same thing, that may be lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3. But all of that evidence is to prepare, so that content is to deliver the knowledge and understanding, and the internal assessment is an opportunity for learners to respond to a brief as they would in the external assessment, and actually be able to provide evidence that is an individual response. So although those classwork tasks and evidence are really important, what they wouldn't do is just submit that task for an internal assignment brief, because for a start it wouldn't meet that scenario, because they'll be working to a work-based real working scenario, and 2, it might not fit those particular constraints of that brief. So yes, it is needed. Students can refer to that sort of knowledge and those sort of class tasks that they've actually undertaken when in the teaching and learning, but they wouldn't actually be submitting that work. It would be new work, if you like, a new response to that internal assessment task, that assignment brief that's issued within that time that's allocated for the assessment.
And the other question, I might need a little bit of clarification on this actually. Can these LO1 criteria be found in the level 2 QualHub area? I think you might mean the level 1 criteria be found in the level 2 QualHub area. If that's what you mean, the specification on the level 2 page would only contain the level 2 grading descriptors. That is what you meant, okay. Yeah, I believe you'd have to go onto the level 1 QualHub page. Is that correct, Leslie?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so two separate specifications there. So what we've done for this presentation, we've just pulled it together just so we can talk through, because we've got many centres as well who deliver level 1 and level 2 together. If that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he's saying yes, that makes sense. He says, excuse me, yes, he does understand that one, thankfully. That's all the questions for now, so I'll let you crack.
Yeah, we'll move
next
on
learning outcome.
We'll move on to learning outcome 2. So learning outcome 2, this is a very practical learning outcome. And this is being designed to build on sort of the research and the investigation. So they've looked at some existing work for learning outcome 1. They've actually started to do some research themselves. So again, they might have been given some examples, but they should also be encouraged to look for their own examples. And then learning outcome 2 is very much about using that research to actually start to experiment with the graphic design components themselves. So a very practical learning outcome for this one. And again, we must see demonstration of the use of colour, tone, line, composition, typography and imagery. And again, it's just important to remind us here, again, it's up to centres how they wish to deliver and assess this content. However, the most logical approach would be to allow learners to do this in a series of practical workshops. Access to physical and digital resources is also best practice, although not mandatory. We do know that there are some restrictions in centres and also with staff expertise who are teaching on the programme. But ideally, physical and digital resources is best practice. This could be assessed in a separate internal assessment task or as part of a larger project assignment. And it's important to remember that this is still an assessment and learners should be working independently. So what some centres like to have 3 assignments. So they might have an assignment, an internal assessment task for learning outcome 1 that separates the research. Then they issue a second assignment, a second internal assessment task for learning outcome 2, and then a third one for learning outcome 3. And that's absolutely fine. However, we do have some centres who prefer a bit more of a project approach, and they will just issue one sort of larger project, and it might have milestones. So for example, by a certain date, students are expected to evidence the research, which will be learning outcome 1. A little bit longer milestone for learning outcome 2, with again an indication of a date when to guide learners when that should be finished, and then that review at the end if centres actually want to set an assignment for learning outcome 3 as a review. Again, there's many different approaches of how you might want to assess these. So here we can see the level 2 assessment criteria. It's good to mention here that the experimentation must be purposeful. So it needs to be in response to a brief or an assessment task that's issued by the assessor. It should not just be samples of experiments that the learner has done in class for a number of different lessons. I think we touched on this a little bit just then with learning outcome 1, as this would be part of the teaching and learning stage. So the teaching and learning stage is about delivering the content to prepare the learners to respond to this internal assessment, assignment, project, whichever we call it. And the evidence for assessment must have a purpose that learners can respond to individually, for example, a scenario in the assignment brief. And again, just to reiterate, NCFE do have examples there on QualHub but please do edit those scenarios, change them. You know your learners better than we do, so it's always good to use them as a guide, but make the tweaks, the edits as you see fit. So I think the key here is about purposeful experiments, even at the lowest grade for a pass. And then through to a merit, we've got some focused experiments with evidence of how this is being used in the development of ideas. So again, the experimentation will be purposeful because they're actually developing ideas in response to a brief. And then at distinction, this is where we'd see thorough experiments with clear evidence of how this is being used. And then if we look at the examples on the right-hand side, it's also about how students will evidence communicating their ideas, so how they will evidence using the components, colour, tone, line, composition, typography, etc. And a really good way how to do this, it's not the only way, is to encourage learners to annotate their visual experiments. So they might be working in a sketchpad, or they could be working digitally, and they might be creating a blog or have some screenshots in a Word document. But really good practice is to encourage them to annotate. So where they're sort of experimenting with colour, just some simple notes to say, here I'm experimenting with colour. And if they're combining that with some tone and line, simple notes just to communicate those ideas and the reasons why. And at the higher end criteria, this is where we'd be looking for learners to make sure that they're making purposeful links. So it could be referring back to the design brief that they've been given. It could be a particular target audience, or it could be a client have asked for a particular colour scheme. And this is where we can see these thorough experiments within the development of ideas, and really good practice as well for the external assessment when learners will be required to respond to a brief there as well. So here we can see the level 1 assessment criteria. And again, this might be slightly easier to interpret as it's mostly quantified regarding how many components the learner is required to evidence. So some basic experimentation on one component, then we've got more than one, and then at distinction carries out experiments with links to ideas. So here, a student might just have the practical evidence, but it should be obvious that they're using one component at pass. So they might not have any annotations here, but it should be clear to the assessor that they're experimenting with colour. At a merit, we should be able to see a minimum of 2 components there. So again, they might not want to write anything or annotate, but there should be some clear evidence that there's 2 components within the practical experimentation. And then for a distinction, we would expect, because we have to see some links to ideas, we would expect some very basic annotation here of the reasons why they've chosen a particular technique to experiment with. So I'll just pause again to see if there's any questions on Learning Outcome 2.
Yep, just got one question in. I think this is kind of around the classwork question that was asked earlier. For the learning outcome, if they, for example, produce a research page, should I advise them not to add screenshots from the teacher-led work?
I think I understand the question. I think you might mean if it's research and the teacher has provided an example, then that can be used as part of the research. That's okay, because you can, as part of the internal assessment task, the assignment brief, if teachers are fine to give examples, as a starting point for learners, that's no problem. They can give them web links for ideas to go and look at. That's okay, that's fine. When we're talking about including evidence of the teaching and learning content, we just wouldn't want to see just a submission of all the classwork that's happened maybe in weeks 1 to 6 when they're sort of having the lessons. Not sure if I've answered the question correctly, but please tell me if you meant something else.
Yeah, does that help there, Sandra, with that question? Hopefully it does, or she might be. Oh, it does. Yes.
Okay.
I'll let you know if she adds anything extra, but just
Okay.
yeah for that. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll
I
let
know
you
sometimes it's okay. It's
Sorry,
sometimes a little bit, it is a little bit tricky sometimes. I think that the takeaway from this is just to try and think of all of the content, whether you deliver it in sections, or some centres deliver all of the content at the start of the term, if you like, the semester, and then so they deliver all the content for learning outcome 1, 2 and 3, and then they give an assignment at the end. Some centres find that learners respond better, particularly level 1 learners. They prefer to deliver the content for learning outcome 1 while it's fresh in their mind, give them an assignment just for learning outcome 1. Then they like to move on to learning outcome 2, just give them assignment for learning outcome 2, and the same for learning outcome 3. So again, it's really thinking about your learners, how you think they'll best respond, and working in your assessment team as well, whether there's more than one of you teaching on this. You might be teaching by yourself, or there might be a team of you. You might have an assessment team. So again, it's just thinking about how your learners would best respond there. Okay, so I'll move on to learning outcome 3. So learning outcome 3 is all about reviewing the experimentation work that the learners have undertaken in learning outcome 2. And there's also some difference between level 1 and level 2 here. So it's quite different to the other learning outcomes with regard to the actual review. So for level 2, we can see learners are required to evaluate. I think I might just need to click on the next slide. So sorry, these are the areas that learners should be reflecting upon within their experimentation. So at level 2, we can see learners are required to evaluate 2 areas, whilst level 1 learners are required to evaluate just 1 area. And it's important to notice that both levels of evaluation should be focused on the visual impact of the experimentation work, and that'll make a bit more sense when we move to the assessment criteria. So the review shouldn't be on any of the work that they've done in learning outcome 1, although that might inform it with the research, but the review is just on the visual impact of their experimentation work that they've previously undertaken in learning outcome 2. So here we can see the level 2 assessment criteria. I'll just go back a slide, because just to put these in a little bit more context. Oh, David, sorry, I think I'm going the wrong way. Could you take me back to the slide? Yes, that's the one. I skipped slightly ahead on my notes there, apologies. So straight from the specification, the bottom part of the slide here, these are the areas that learners should be reflecting upon within their experiment. So these are really good prompts. So they should be thinking about associations of shapes, textures, patterns, reactions, communication of meaning within their work, impressions, and how the experimentations could be applied, with the components of graphic design. So there's just some prompts there that you might want to include within your assessment tasks for the review for learning outcome 3. So here we can see the level 2 assessment criteria, and we can see that the evaluation must be focused on the graphic design components and how learners have used these to create impact within their own experimentation work. Now, important to understand that learners do not have to complete final work to do this. And this is probably one of the biggest misinterpretations from centres, that they think they have to produce final work for Unit 1, and they don't. It can just be experimental work, and it can be more than one piece as well. So it doesn't have to be a final piece of work. Now, evidence of this could be annotations actually on the experimental work. So again, it could be screenshots if they're digital, or it could actually be annotations on the sketchpad work, or if they work on design sheets, whichever method they're working, it could be annotations there. Some centres also like to have a production diary. And again, sometimes that is a written diary, and students keep notes of what they've done. And that can be used as good evidence for the evaluation here for the review for Learning Outcome 3. And also some students like to produce a blog. So they might put some screenshots in a blog, or they might just keep sort of a weekly, or whenever the lessons are, an account, a review of what they've done. And they might be using this subject terminology, the components that they might have used. And this means that the actual review becomes part of, or runs alongside, the work that they're doing for Learning Outcome 2. So they're sort of doing both at the same time if they work in this way. So as long as that they're doing some valid review within the notes, so this description, if you like, for pass, merit, distinction, they don't really have to do a separate evaluation. So all of that review can be evidenced within the experimentation work, provided that they have got some annotation or some sort of diary or production notes there. That's absolutely fine. So again, you may want to do a separate evaluation, or you may want learners to do this ongoing as part of their experimental work. And that's, both of those approaches are fine. Some centres also might have students who are maybe more confident to talk about their work. So they find that maybe written communication is not as good as maybe their verbal communication, and that's absolutely fine too. So they could actually present some of their work, and they could have like a little audio recording. Doesn't have to be video, but we would need to see evidence. Your EQA would need to see evidence of what you've used here. So it could be a presentation, an observation record to accompany that. So there's different ways to evidence this criteria. Please don't think it just has to be a written evaluation. So we are quite flexible in evidence, as long as it allows the learners to meet those criteria. And then for level 1 criteria, again, as with previous LOs, again, there tends to be a quantified descriptor here of regarding how many components the learner is required to evidence. So again, we can see identify, so quite a low level descriptor, identify 2 obvious visual impacts. These can be bullet points for identify. There doesn't need to be any great detail. For merit, we've got identify 3 visual impacts, and distinction, it's still identify, but there is a requirement here for some explanation of choices. So again, that could be very basic notes there. So just before we move on to look at some examples of learners' work and how these assessment criteria look in practice, I'll just see if there's any questions that have come in for Learning Outcome 3.
No questions at the minute, no. So it looks like we're all good to have a look at some exemplar work.
Okay, great. And before, what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll through these at a certain pace, because we've got 2 pieces of work to look at. There's a pass and there's a distinction. But just to remind you that, please don't think you have to sort of keep up too much. I'm going to talk briefly through them where the student has addressed the criteria, but remember that there is the PDF that you can download and look at in your own time. Really useful to do when you can sort of look at your own pace. So we'll start with a level 2 pass. So this student has achieved a pass for Learning Outcome 1, a pass for Learning Outcome 2, and a pass for Learning Outcome 3. So an overall grade unit of a pass. And just to remind you, they must achieve the same grade in all of the learning outcomes to achieve the overall unit grade. So for example, if it was a merit, the student would need to get a merit in learning outcome 1, 2 and 3. If for one reason they did better in learning outcome 1 and 2, research and experimentation, they got a merit, but the review wasn't so good, so they only got a pass for the review, then that whole unit grade would stay as a pass, and the same applies for merit and distinction. Okay, so the learner has started off with a contents page. Now this learner submitted the work in a PowerPoint presentation. Again, we see lots of this. It seems to be quite a common method. Learners like working in this, and centres find it quite easy for learners to be able to submit that work for assessment. So they've laid out a nice clear contents page for their PowerPoint. So straight away we can see that they're going to cover all of the 6 components. And how this centre approached it, they've asked students to evidence all learning outcomes within the same presentation. And again, this is just one way. It's an example. It's not the only way. So the student goes through colour, tone, imagery, line composition, and typography. So they do the description for learning outcome 1. They show their experimentation, and then part of the experimentation notes, they're also evidencing learning outcome 3. So they start with colour, and they have some description of the colour wheel and different combinations of colour. They then go on to use examples. So I'll just pause a little bit just to let everybody have a read here. And again, it's, they may have had some links, or, in the assignment brief, it's fine to actually give some resource links. It's absolutely fine. But, they should also be looking for their own examples here. And then they define, which is really useful, especially for assessors, your internal quality assurers and your external quality assurers. It's really useful if the learners sort of lay this out in this way. It makes it really clear to see what they're addressing. So here we can see they're moving on to learning outcome 2 here, because it's experimentation. And you'll see that their annotations have actually started to describe what they've done, and they've also started to evidence some learning outcome 3 here, because learning outcome 3, if you remember, is sort of looking at how their experimentation, reviewing what the visual impact is of that. So they've started to do that as well here. They then move on to typography. So again, they follow the same sort of approach. They've explained the component, looked at some examples, and then did some of their own experimentation. And they go on to line. And again, this is just one way of presenting. We do see lots of different evidence submitted and different approaches. You know, some students might have a sketchbook or a series of design boards. So, you know, please don't think that they have to present it in a well-presented presentation. So this is just one approach. So they move on to composition. And then at the end, they've actually tied this all together. And I understand it might not be as clear. However, there was actually the design brief for this particular piece of work was for the learners to come up with some business card designs. So they've actually used their sort of experimentation, the techniques to come up with these designs. Most excuse me, most learners actually would probably maybe start off with this is what I've been asked to do, this is my interpretation of the brief. Some learners do better than others in that way, but that's not part of the assessment criteria. So although they must be responding to a brief set by the centre, you know, we're not looking for a huge amount of detail of what they've been asked to do and the decisions made, etc. Unit 1 is purely very much an introduction unit and getting them to experiment with the techniques. So then we'll look at the second example, which is a level 2 distinction. And again, so this student, learning outcome 1, learning outcome 2, and learning outcome 3 has achieved a distinction. And again, they start off with a well-presented contents page. And straight away, hopefully you can see the difference between the two learners. I know we're very early on in the presentation here, but it's important to understand as well. I know I keep saying this is just one example, but I don't want to, sometimes centres get a little bit concerned about the amount of slides on this one. So there's quite a lot of slides here, but that doesn't mean that, you know, every student for a distinction has to do this amount. You know, it's not just the quantity here, but it's the quality of the content here. And if we remember, learning outcome 1 here is looking for the links to different components. Learning outcome 2 is about showing how to communicate their understanding of of how the components are used. So quite a lot of annotation on here as well, explaining how they've experimented and the decisions that they've made, what they wanted to do, what they wanted to achieve with those experiments. It's quite a nice page again of typography, really well presented. But I think what you'll notice here as well, the difference between this learner and the past learner, there's a lot more understanding demonstrated. Even the subject terminology is definitely more apparent here. And they've got some experimentations here. And they're talking about their business card designs as well. And continue tone. Get the same approach. They start off with their description of line, experiment with the use of line, and within this annotation they're reviewing their experimentation. So you've got the evidence of learning outcomes 3 here as part of this experimentation rather than a separate review at the end. And that in this particular piece of work, it worked quite well. And I think for this particular learner, they've produced a lot within their portfolio, if you like. So they've got a business card design. They've considered poster designs. I think now they're looking for labelling, packaging also. There's a real demonstration of understanding here. I think these work quite well, so they've tried to put these in situ, if you like, of how their designs might look. It's a really nice presentation, how they've done that. And just to remind you as well, although this learner has produced some final work, it's not a requirement for this unit. So, a portfolio of experimentation is absolutely fine. But hopefully you'll agree that's a real strong example there of a level 2 distinction. But again, it's just one approach to show you there. So that brings us to the end of there. And I realise I did whiz through it quite quickly, but please do download the PDF because it is really useful for when you start to assess, or you might be assessing at the moment. I think it's a really useful tool just to look at something, a visual example, to help you with your own assessment. Okay, thanks, David. I think there's a poll.
Yes, thank you very much for that, Leslie. It's quite useful to actually see that myself. My background's science, but it's nice the way it's actually laid out and actually seeing that to hit those.
We're seeing some fantastic, we're seeing some fabulous work for graphic design. It's fantastic to see.
I've put that poll up on at the start again, just seeing if any of you are feeling a little bit more confident with the Unit 1 work now in terms of assessing it and so on. Oh, wow. Okay. 50 at the minute, quite a few votes in. Confidence gone up, that's good to see. 7 to 8, even a few 33% in the 9 to 10 range, 67% in the 7 to 8. It's good that you're feeling much more confident with regards to this work. We'll remain on here for the next few moments anyways. If you do have any other questions, do please get them into that question box.
And it is, I was just going to
Good.
I was just going to say, David, you know, it is daunting, and, you know, please do make sure that you use, you know, your external quality assurer to, you know, to have discussions of any concerns you've got. You know, please don't think that your EQA, your external quality assurer, just has to come out to see you once or twice a year, and you don't have to have any communication with them before then. You know, they are a really good source of knowledge, and they're more than happy to help you. So please don't think that you're on your own with this.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, certainly to make, especially since I'm just putting on this slide now. So I do want to thank everyone for attending this webinar. And as I said, myself and Leslie, and many thanks as well to yourself, Leslie, for your support with this. If you do have any questions, you can contact me directly, davidkiernan@ncfe.org.uk, or if I'm unavailable, our general email address is curriculum@ncfe.org.uk. But as Leslie said, I'll be able to help you with sort of the model of delivery and assessment and so on. If it comes to something subject specific, please don't email me. That's where your EQA is definitely going to be best suited to help you out with that. And as I said, we will remain on here for the remaining 5 minutes or so. And if you don't have any questions, that's fine. You can leave. There will be a little evaluation that will pop up. I'd appreciate it if you'd fill that out.